The Cage, Part 2. Chapter 4, The Fluorescent Life. The alarm screamed at 5:45 a.m. like it did every morning, and like every morning, John didn't move. He lay on his back in the narrow bed of his childhood, staring at the ceiling where a water stain had been slowly spreading since he was 11. It looked like a hand. It had always looked like a hand. Some mornings it looked like it was reaching for him. Other mornings it looked like it was pressing down. He listened. The house spoke first. It always did. The groan of pipes in the walls, the refrigerator humming its one dead note through the floor, and beneath that, footsteps, heavy, arrhythmic. His father's boots on the kitchen tile. John tracked the sound the way a submarine tracks a depth charge. Kitchen, moving toward the coffee maker. The clatter of a mug. Talk radio bleeding through the walls. Some pundit screaming about the national debt. His father's preferred morning liturgy. Location confirmed. First floor. East side of the house. He had 6 minutes. John moved through his morning routine with the efficiency of a man who had memorized every creaking floorboard and every sight line in this house by the age of 7. Clothes selected the night before. Nothing that would attract attention. Nothing that would invite comment. Shower with the door locked, eyes on the handle, 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Teeth brushed, face studied in the mirror for exactly as long as it took to confirm he was still there, which some mornings took longer than others. This morning took longer. Something in the reflection seemed slightly off, not wrong, not distorted, but denser, as though the glass were holding more of him than it should. He leaned closer. His eyes were brown. They had always been brown, but for a moment, in the bad bathroom light, he could have sworn there was a ring of something darker at the edges of each iris. Something that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. He blinked. Brown, just brown. He shut off the light and moved. The hallway was a 12-foot kill zone between his bedroom and the stairs. He paused at his door, listening again. His father's boots had moved to the living room. The television joined the talk radio in a duet of noise. Clear. He passed the basement door on his way down. It was closed as it always was. Just a door. White paint. Brass knob. A half-inch gap at the bottom where cold air seeped through like breath. John's hand twitched as he passed it. He did not look at it. He never looked at it. His body looked at it for him, every nerve ending orienting toward it the way a compass orients toward north, or the way a wound orients toward the thing that made it. The kitchen smelled like coffee and eggs and silence. Sandra Krieger stood at the stove with her back to the doorway, moving a spatula through a pan with the mechanical devotion of a woman who had replaced interiority with routine. 2 plates on the table. His father's eggs, toast, bacon, the geometry of a man who expected the world arranged to his specifications. And Marcus's plate, set with the same care, fork and knife aligned, napkin folded, even though Marcus hadn't lived in this house for 3 years. Even though Marcus was in Connecticut with his fiancée and his dental practice and his clean, uncomplicated life. The plate sat there like a reliquary, a shrine maintained by a mother whose love had only ever had one direction. There was no plate for John. He poured cereal standing at the counter, eating over the sink. Sandra didn't turn around. She didn't say good morning. She existed in the same room as her son, the way a planet exists in the same solar system as a piece of debris, technically proximate, gravitationally indifferent. His father's footsteps entered the kitchen. Michael Krieger Sr. was 61 years old and built like a man who had never encountered a consequence. Broad through the chest, thick-necked, hands that could palm a basketball or fracture an orbital bone with equal ease. He wore his authority like weather, constant, ambient, not subject to appeal. He moved to the table, sat, pulled his plate toward him. He spoke to Sandra about the eggs. He spoke to Sandra about the talk radio host. He spoke to Sandra about the lawn. He did not speak to John. He did not look at John. John occupied the same kitchen as his father the way a stain occupies a floor, something to be stepped over, something that should have been cleaned up long ago. John rinsed his bowl, placed it in the drying rack, and left through the side door with his keys in his hand and his jaw clenched so tight his molars ached. The stray cat that usually lingered on the back steps, a ragged orange tabby that John sometimes fed scraps to, was sitting on the bottom stair. It saw him come through the door and bolted, not casually, not the way cats leave. It fled, low to the ground, ears flat, as though something behind John had bared its teeth. John watched it go. He'd been feeding that cat for 6 months. The Q-32 ran down Northern Boulevard through Jackson Heights like a vein through a body that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. John climbed on at 74th Street and found his seat, back corner, left side, spine against the wall so no one could get behind him. Headphones in. Hood up. Eyes forward but awareness everywhere. A sonar sweep that never powered down. Outside the window, the neighborhood churned through its morning liturgy. The Dominican barber shop on Roosevelt Avenue was already open. 2 old men in the chairs arguing about baseball through hot towels. The halal cart on the corner of 37th Avenue was setting up, the smell of lamb and diesel mixing in the gray morning air. A group of Ecuadorian day laborers stood outside the hardware store on Broadway, hands in pockets, breath visible, waiting to be chosen. Jackson Heights was like that, 100 countries compressed into 40 blocks, everyone performing survival in their own language, everyone moving through the same streets without ever occupying the same world. John fit here the way he fit everywhere, which was to say he didn't, but at least here no one noticed. He made himself small. He had always made himself small, shoulders rounded, arms close, legs together. A man who had been taught since birth that his body was an imposition and his presence a provocation. He took up less space than any man his size should. The bus stopped at a red light on Junction Boulevard. John glanced at the digital clock above the driver's head. 7:17. He looked down at his phone. 7:17. He looked at the receipt crumpled in his jacket pocket from the bodega last night. The total at the bottom, $7.17. His eyes drifted to the license plate of the car, idling next to the bus. New York plates. The last three digits, 717. A cold thread stitched itself through his chest. He'd been seeing it for weeks. Not just 717, though that was the most frequent. It was patterns, repetitions, the same numbers surfacing across unrelated surfaces like a watermark bleeding through from the other side of reality. The world was developing a syntax, and it seemed to be aimed at him specifically, and he could not for the life of him figure out why. He told himself it was pareidolia, pattern recognition in a patternless world. The human brain finding signal in noise because the alternative, that the noise was random and meaningless, and he was random and meaningless within it, was worse than delusion. But this morning, as the bus lurched forward and Junction Boulevard blurred past, a homeless man on the corner turned his head and looked directly at John through the window. Not at the bus, at John. Through the glass, through the crowd, through the hood and the headphones and the practiced invisibility. The man's mouth moved. John couldn't hear the words through the glass, but he read the shape of them on the man's cracked lips. He sees you. The bus moved on. The man was gone. John's hands were shaking in his lap. 3 blocks later, he passed a church with a marquee that read God's love is unconditional in letters that were missing the O. John stared at it as the bus pulled away. GDSLVE is UNCDDNAL. Even the sign couldn't get through the sentence without losing something essential. On the wall beside the church, someone had spray-painted graffiti in red block letters, still dripping. What fills the empty? No question mark. Not a question. A statement waiting for its subject. First National Savings occupied the ground floor of a building that had given up. The facade was beige stucco with water damage. The lobby was beige carpet with coffee stains. The lighting was fluorescent and unforgiving, the kind of light that doesn't illuminate so much as expose, turning every face into a mug shot, every surface into evidence. The air tasted like toner and recycled breath. John's workstation was window 4. A bulletproof partition separated him from the customers. 3 inches of polycarbonate glass that could stop a .44 Magnum round. He sat behind it for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, visible but untouchable, present but partitioned. A man behind glass. He'd been behind glass his whole life. The material had simply become literal. He counted money, other people's money. 10s and 20s and the occasional 100 slid through the slot toward him, and he counted them with the precise, mechanical focus of a man who had learned that if his hands were busy, his mind could go somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere the fluorescent lights didn't hum at a frequency that matched the ringing in his ears that the doctor said was stress, and the prescription said was fixable, and the pills in his medicine cabinet said was none of their business, because he'd never opened the bottle. The morning passed in transactions. Deposits, withdrawals, the occasional wire transfer that required Gerald's signature, which meant Gerald's presence, which meant Gerald's opportunity. The clock on the wall read 11:17 when John noticed it. He looked away, looked back. 11:17. The second hand was moving, but the minute hand wasn't. He watched it for 10 seconds, 15, and then it jumped to 11:18, as though catching up with itself, as though time had paused to make sure he'd seen the number. He rubbed his eyes. He was tired. He was always tired. Sleep had become a country whose visa he'd been denied. He could see it from a distance, but the border was closed. 3 hours a night if he was lucky, and those 3 hours were populated by hallways and locked doors, and a sound he could never identify, but that he knew the way you know your own heartbeat, a low rhythmic thudding that lived beneath the architecture of every dream he'd had since he was 5 years old. Krieger. Gerald Fisk appeared behind John's station the way weather appears on a radar, suddenly from a direction you should have been watching. Gerald was 5'6" and 140 pounds of middle management. He had a corner office with a motivational poster that read excellence is not an act but a habit, a master's degree from a school no one had heard of, and the soul of a parking meter. He was not cruel in any way that could be reported, documented, or addressed by human resources. He was cruel in the way that water is cruel to rock, constant, ambient, and absolutely confident that time was on his side. Your count was off on the Meridian deposit yesterday. It wasn't. John said it before he could stop himself. Quietly, almost inaudibly, but he said it. Gerald leaned closer. Excuse me? I counted it twice. It balanced. Gerald smiled. It was a small smile, the smile of a man who has just been given a gift he didn't expect. Let's recount together then, right now. while Mrs. Halstead waits." He gestured to the elderly woman at John's window, who was already checking her watch. They recounted. The count was correct. John's count had been correct. Gerald studied the figures, paused, then said, "Better. Let's make sure it stays that way." He patted John's shoulder, one firm pat, proprietary, a pat that said, "I own this interaction and we both know it," and walked away. John's hands gripped the counter. His jaw locked. Something moved behind his eyes, not a thought, not an emotion, something older than both. A heat that started at the base of his skull and pressed forward into his optic nerves like a tide of molten copper. The fluorescent lights above window 4 didn't flicker this time. They died. The entire row, 6 tubes, 18 feet of fluorescent lighting, went black above John's station, and only John's station, plunging window 4 into a pocket of shadow while the rest of the bank hummed on in its sterile brightness. In that shadow, behind the bulletproof glass, John Krieger's eyes were no longer brown. They were red, not bloodshot, not irritated. Red, a deep arterial crimson that started at the iris and bled outward until the whites were gone, until there was nothing in those sockets but 2 flat discs of living fire that cast no light but absorbed it, that pulled the remaining glow from the lobby the way a drain pulls water, the way a wound pulls blood, the way a vacuum pulls air from a breached hull. Mrs. Halstead saw it first. She was 68 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Astoria who had been coming to this branch for 11 years. She had seen every teller this bank had ever employed through that window. She had never seen anything like what she was seeing now. The man behind the glass was looking at her with eyes that belonged to something that had never been a man, and every hair on her arm stood at attention, and her hand gripped the counter so hard the bones of her knuckles pressed white against the skin, and her mouth opened to say something, a word, a name, a prayer, and nothing came out. The teller at window 3, Priya Anand, 26, 3 months on the job, turned at the sound of the lights dying and saw John's profile in the darkness. She saw the red. She saw it clearly. Her hand came off her keyboard and pressed flat against her chest as though holding her heart in place. Gerald Fisk was halfway across the lobby when the lights went out above window 4. He turned. He saw the shadow. He saw, or thought he saw, or refused to admit he saw, something in that shadow that made the motivational poster in his office feel like a joke written in a language that didn't matter. His step faltered. One half step, a barely perceptible stutter in his confident managerial stride. Then the lights buzzed back on, all 6 tubes, 18 feet, as though nothing had happened, and John was blinking behind the glass, rubbing his eyes, looking confused and tired and ordinary. No one spoke. That was the strangest part. In a lobby with 14 people, 6 employees, 8 customers, not a single person said a word about what had just happened. Mrs. Halstead gathered her purse and left without completing her transaction. She would not return to this branch. She would switch to the Chase on Northern Boulevard, and when her daughter asked why, she would say parking and change the subject and not think about the man behind the glass, except on the nights when she did, which would be more nights than she'd ever admit. Priya Anand finished her shift in silence. She drove home to her apartment in Sunnyside and sat in the parking lot for 15 minutes with the engine running. That night she slept with the bathroom light on. In the morning she found that the mirror above her bathroom sink had developed a crack she'd never seen before, a single fissure running vertically through the glass, splitting her reflection into 2 halves that didn't quite align. She called her landlord. He said it was the cold. She agreed it was the cold. But she brushed her teeth in the kitchen after that, and she didn't look at the mirror again. Gerald Fisk did not correct John Krieger for the rest of the week. He did not approach window 4. When asked by a colleague why he was avoiding that side of the lobby, he said the lighting over there gave him headaches. He believed this was the reason. It wasn't. The security camera footage from that afternoon would show a 9-second gap at 11:47 a.m. 9 seconds of static where window 4 should have been. The IT technician reviewed it, attributed it to a firmware glitch, filed a maintenance ticket, and moved on far above the world, in a place that was not a place. The Archangel Michael stood on the ramparts of a silence that had become unbearable. He had been watching. He was always watching. It was his function, his purpose, the reason the sword existed, and the reason the wings never folded. But watching had become something else in recent days. It had become witnessing. And witnessing, unlike watching, left marks. He had seen the boy, the man now, 24 years of wreckage walking upright, sit behind his glass window and count other people's money while the thing inside him tested its walls. He had seen the lights die. He had seen the red. He had seen 14 people in a bank lobby collectively decide that what they'd witnessed hadn't happened, the same way humanity had been collectively deciding since the garden that the things they couldn't categorize didn't exist. Michael's hand rested on the pommel of his sword. The metal was warm. It had been warm for weeks, a low, constant heat that hadn't been there before, as though the blade itself was responding to something it recognized, something it had been forged to fight. He thought of the vision, the gray beast, the mountain-given locomotion, the flat crimson eyes, the same crimson he had just seen in a bank teller's face in Jackson Heights, Queens. He had buried that vision. He had wrapped it in doctrine and filed it in the deep architecture of his obedience, and told himself that what didn't fit the framework didn't require a response. But the sword was warm, and the vision was leaking. He turned to look toward the throne. The Father sat in the immensity of his silence, a silence that had once felt like sovereignty, and now felt like Michael would not finish the thought. Could not. The grammar of heaven did not contain the word he was reaching for, and his loyalty would not permit him to invent it. The sun stood at the far edge of the throne room, facing away. His shoulders carried something that Michael had never seen on them before. Not grief. The sun had carried grief since Golgotha, had worn it like a second skin, had made it part of his architecture. This was different. This was the posture of someone watching a wound they had agreed not to stitch. The spirit was still. That was the worst part. The spirit, who moved, who was defined by movement, wind and fire and the rushing of waters, was still. Perfectly, terribly still. Like a river that has stopped flowing. Like lungs that have stopped breathing. Like a heart between beats, holding, waiting, refusing to commit to the next contraction until something changed in the calculus of mercy. Nothing changed. Michael looked back down at the world. At the man driving home on the Long Island Expressway with his windows down and his radio off. At the hollow cathedral inside him where the hum was growing louder. At the thing that was not yet awake but was no longer asleep. He should speak. He should walk to the throne and lay the vision at the Father's feet and say, I saw something. I saw it and I buried it, and it is growing, and the sword knows, and the boy is filling with something that has crimson eyes, and I am afraid. He did not speak. He adjusted his grip on the sword and continued to watch. Below him the world turned. Inside the world a man drove home. Inside the man something turned with it. In the break room, John sat alone at the table closest to the wall, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. His eyes were brown. They had always been brown. He did not know what had just happened at his window. He knew only that he had gripped the counter, and then the lights had done something strange, and now he was here, in the break room, with a gap in his memory like a redacted paragraph. The sentence went in one direction, and then jumped to another, and the middle was just black. His hands were trembling. The coffee rippled in the cup. The break room thermostat read 68 degrees. The temperature in the room was 53. No one else was in the break room to notice, but if they had been, they would have seen their breath. The door opened. A man walked in carrying a white bakery box and a grin that could sell you a used car or a coffin with equal conviction. Mid-30s, good suit for a bank teller, dark hair pushed back, the kind of face that moved through the world expecting it to rearrange itself in his favor. He set the box on the table and flipped it open. Cannoli. A dozen of them, hand-rolled, the shells still crisp. The ricotta piped with the precision of a man whose mother had taught him that food was a language, and generosity was its grammar. Tony Castellano, the man said, extending his hand. Transferred from the Astoria branch. Started Monday. You're Krieger, right? Window 4? John looked at the hand. He had learned to distrust open hands. Open hands could become fists. Open hands could pat your shoulder and mean I own you. Open hands could offer something and then invoice you for it later, with interest, when you were too deep in the debt of gratitude to refuse. He shook it anyway. The handshake was warm, firm, calibrated, not the bone-crushing dominance grip his father used, not the limp dismissal of Gerald Fisk. Just a hand, holding his, for exactly the right amount of time. John, he said. John. Tony pulled out the chair across from him and sat down like he'd been sitting there for years. You look like a man who needs a cannoli and a reason not to walk into traffic. I can provide one of those. He pushed the box across the table. The other one's above my pay grade. John almost smiled. The muscles required for it were stiff from disuse, and what reached his face was more of a softening than a smile, but it was there. Tony saw it. Tony, who noticed everything, exits, cameras, shift schedules, the location of the vault, the rotation of the security guard, the make and model of the branch manager's car, noticed the almost smile, and something behind his eyes shifted. Not calculation. Something softer. Something he hadn't expected to feel. Fisk giving you trouble? Tony said, biting into a cannoli with the easy confidence of a man who had never eaten anything apologetically. I've been here 4 days, and I can already tell that guy's got a Napoleon complex the size of the actual Napoleon. He's fine. He's a prick. Tony said it cheerfully, without malice, the way you'd describe the weather. I've worked under a dozen Fisks. Little men with little kingdoms? You know what they're afraid of? John shook his head. Guys like you. Quiet guys. Guys who do the work and don't need the applause. Drives them crazy. They can't figure out where to put you, so they put you down. It's not personal. He pointed a cannoli at John. I mean, it is personal, but it's his personal, not yours. You understand the difference? John didn't. No one had ever suggested to him that another person's cruelty might belong to the cruel person rather than to him. The concept sat in his mind like a foreign object, recognizable as language but not yet as meaning. Tony leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. He looked at the cannoli box, then at the ceiling, and then, unexpectedly, his face changed. The grin faded. Not into sadness, exactly. Into something unguarded, something that had no audience and no angle. My old man used to hit my mother, Tony said. He said it the way you'd say it's supposed to rain tomorrow, flatly, without drama, every Friday, like clockwork. She'd make dinner. He'd find something wrong with it. And then the whole house would go quiet except for the sounds coming from the kitchen. He looked at John. I was 8 before I figured out that wasn't normal. That not every kid spent Friday nights sitting on the stairs with his hands over his ears counting to 100 because his nana told him if you count to 100, anything can be survived. The break room was silent. The fluorescent lights hummed. Tony picked up his cannoli and bit into it. Anyway, he said, that's why I brought the cannoli. My mother's recipe. She started baking after he left. Figured out that the thing she'd been afraid of for 15 years, being alone, was actually the first day of her life. He chewed, swallowed. You eat lunch around here? The pivot was so fast John almost missed it. The door had opened and closed in the same breath. But in the gap, in that 3-second window where Tony Castellano's face had been unarmored, John had seen something he recognized. Not the details. The shape. The shape of a man who had been in a house where love was conditional and violence was the weather. There's a Chinese place on 82nd, John said. Golden Dragon. Any good? The lo mein's decent. Tomorrow. Lunch. My treat. Tony stood, brushed powdered sugar off his lapel, and picked up the bakery box. I'm leaving these in the break room. Tell the others. Actually, don't tell Fisk. Let him find out on his own that there's joy in the building and he wasn't consulted. He left. The door swung shut behind him. The break room was quiet again. John sat with his cold coffee and his trembling hands and a warmth in his chest that he didn't recognize because it wasn't the molten copper heat from before. It wasn't ancient or alien or frightening. It was worse than all of those things. It was hope. Small, tentative, stupid hope. The kind that gets you killed. The kind his father had spent 24 years beating out of him. The kind his mother had prayed away. The kind the adversary had wagered on destroying. It sat in John's chest like a match struck in a dark room, tiny, trembling, and utterly unaware that the room was filled with gas. He bit into a cannoli. The shell cracked between his teeth. The ricotta was sweet. Outside the break room window, a pigeon landed on the sill and watched him with one orange eye. It didn't flee. It sat there, head cocked, as though waiting for something. John drove home that evening on the Long Island Expressway with the windows down and the radio off. He didn't like the radio. Every station was someone else's voice filling a silence he hadn't consented to break. He preferred the wind. The wind didn't need him to respond. The sun was setting over Jackson Heights, painting the elevated 7 train tracks in copper and rust. The train clattered overhead like a mechanical rosary, beads of steel and light clicking past on their way to Manhattan. Below it, the neighborhood was shifting into its evening register. The lunch crowds replaced by the dinner crowds. The day laborers replaced by the night shift workers. The school kids replaced by the teenagers who gathered outside the corner stores with their music and their certainty that the world was something they could bend. John envied them, not the music, the certainty. He had never been certain of anything, except that the next room might contain something that wanted to hurt him. He pulled into the driveway of the Krieger house at 6:47 p.m. His father's truck was there. It was always there. The truck sat in the driveway like a territorial marker, broadcasting ownership over everything within its radius. John parked behind it, which meant he couldn't leave without his father leaving first. He'd been parking behind that truck for 8 years. He'd never thought about what it meant until now, and the thought, when it came, arrived in a voice that didn't quite sound like his own. He has you blocked in. He has always had you blocked in. John sat in the car for a long time. The engine ticked as it cooled. The house watched him through its windows, lights on in the kitchen, the flicker of the television in the living room, the silhouette of his father passing behind the curtain like a shark's fin, cutting still water. Upstairs, his mother's bedroom light was on. She went to bed early these days. She went to bed early because sleep was the only room in the house where her husband couldn't follow, and even that wasn't entirely true, because John had heard her crying through the walls at 3 a.m., often enough to know that whatever she was running from ran with her. He got out of the car. The evening air was cool and smelled like exhaust and fried plantains from the Ecuadorian restaurant on the corner. The orange tabby was not on the steps. It had not come back since that morning. Its food bowl sat on the bottom stair, untouched, dry kibble gathering dew. John went inside. He passed his father in the living room without a word. He climbed the stairs. He passed the bathroom, the hallway, his brother's empty room with its trophies and its twin bed still made, a museum of the favored son. He stopped at the top of the stairs. Below him, at the bottom of the staircase, the basement door was visible. White paint, brass knob, the half-inch gap at the bottom where the cold air seeped through. He had passed that door 10,000 times. He had averted his eyes 10,000 times. His body had flinched from it, routed around it, built an entire architecture of avoidance so thorough that he could navigate the house in complete darkness and never come within 3 feet of that knob. Tonight, he looked at it. not past it, not around it. He stood at the top of the stairs and he looked at the basement door, the way you look at a grave you've been pretending isn't there. His heart was pounding. His palms were slick. Every synapse in his nervous system was firing the old alarms. Don't look, don't see, don't acknowledge. If you don't look at it, then it didn't happen. And if it didn't happen, then you're fine. And if you're fine, then you can keep going. And if you keep going, then maybe tomorrow will be different. He looked. The door looked back. Something shifted inside him. Not the molten copper heat. Not the hum. Something quieter. Something structural. The way a key shifts in a lock before the bolt turns. The way a foundation shifts before a building settles into its final shape. Something deep in the architecture of John Krieger, in the hollow cathedral where his father's love should have been, where his mother's protection should have lived, moved, not forward, not backward. It moved aside, as though making room. John pulled his eyes away. His hands were shaking. His breath was coming in short, ragged pulls. He didn't know what had just happened. He knew only that he had looked at the door, and the door had acknowledged him, and that acknowledgment had rearranged something inside his chest that he didn't have the language to name. He went to his room. He closed the door. He lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the water stain on the ceiling. The hand was still there. But tonight, in the fading light, it didn't look like it was reaching for him or pressing down. It looked like it was opening. In the space between waking and sleep, John Krieger heard something, not with his ears, with a hollow place inside him where a father's love should have been, where a mother's protection should have lived, where a brother's recognition should have built the first fragile scaffolding of selfhood. The place that had been emptied, room by room, year by year, until it was nothing but architecture, walls without furniture, hallways without doors, a cathedral without a congregation. Something was moving through that cathedral, not footsteps, not a voice, a frequency, a low subsonic hum that resonated in his marrow and made his teeth ache, and turned the blood in his veins half a degree warmer. It wasn't malevolent. It wasn't benevolent. It was interested, the way a hand is interested in a glove, the way water is interested in a crack in the foundation, the way fire is interested in a house that has been soaked in gasoline and is only waiting for a reason. In his half-sleep, John's lips moved. He wasn't aware of it. If anyone had been in the room, and no one was, because no one had ever been in his room, not once in 24 years, not to check on him, not to say good night, not to sit on the edge of the bed and ask him about his day, they would have seen his lips form a single word, barely a whisper, the barest exhalation of a man who had never been taught to pray, but whose emptiness had become a prayer all on its own. Why? The hum deepened. The water stain on the ceiling seemed to pulse once in the darkness. The temperature in the room dropped 4 degrees, and somewhere far above the atmosphere, far above the orbits of satellites and the mathematics of human understanding, in a throne room built from solidified light, where a wager had been made over the soul of an infant who would grow into this man, in this bed, in this room, in this house, that had never once been a home, something that had been watching since before the foundations of the world leaned forward, not to answer, to listen. John slept. The house settled around him. The orange tabby did not return. And downstairs at the bottom of the staircase, the basement door, which had been closed when John looked at it, which had been closed every day for 19 years, which no one had opened and no one had touched, was now open. 1 inch, just 1 inch. A sliver of darkness visible through the gap, thicker than the darkness in the hallway, denser, older, as though the air on the other side of that door had been held in something's lungs for a very long time, and was only now being released. Through that gap, the cold seeped upward through the house. It climbed the stairs. It moved along the hallway. It passed Marcus's empty room without pausing. It stopped at John's door and waited. End of part 2.